Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to Reading in the Dark. Byron here. This video is going to be my wrap-up for Contemporary-A-Thon Round 4, which literally just ended, or actually technically hasn't even ended yet. It's going to end in like an hour, but also in an hour, Thriller-A-Thon starts. So I thought, since I just finished my third book, I would just end Contemporary-A-Thon time a little bit early, film a wrap-up so that I can then switch gears and get ready for the next readathon, because if I don't, I just moved my microphone. I knew that if I didn't just jump on this wrap-up right away, I have no idea when I would have time to get it filmed, or when it would end up being posted. It would be way after Thriller-A-Thon, which would mean it would be like way after the end of Contemporary-A-Thon, which would just be weird. So I'm doing it now, like right away. So I had chosen 4 books for this readathon. There were some challenges for Contemporary-A-Thon Round 4. One was to read a book in a non-traditional format, in no particular order. Read a book in a non-traditional format, a book you meant to read in 2018, a book with the color blurple on the cover, which is blue and purple, to read a dark, spooky, or taboo contemporary, to read a diverse contemporary with a picture on the spine, or your most recently acquired contemporary. So for these I chose Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday, which is a non-traditional format because it's told in 3 very different sections, separate stories that eventually appear to connect to one another. And it's also a book that I meant to read last year because I chose it for my TBR for Contemporary-A-Thon last time and never got to it. The next book that I chose was Fresh Complaint by Jeffrey Eugenides. This is a short story collection by the man who wrote Middlesex and The Virgin Suicides, and one other novel that I'm forgetting the name of. I heard him interviewed on a radio program that I enjoy listening to on a podcast called Writers on Writing, and he sounded really great. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author for Middlesex, and it has blurple all over the cover, just proudly. Philip, you can't. I'm sorry. My dog really wants to chew his bone, but it's super loud. So it is a non-traditional format as a short story collection, and it has blurple all over the quite cool looking cover. The next book that I chose was Up From the Blue by Susan Henderson for my dark, spooky, taboo contemporary, because it covers a lot of dark, very intense themes. And then I also chose An Orchestra of Minorities by Chigozie Obioma for a contemporary with a book with a picture on the spine, and for a diverse contemporary. He's a Nigerian author. I read Asymmetry, Fresh Complaint, and Up From the Blue, but I did not get to An Orchestra of Minorities because I realized that if I tried to start that tonight, I would certainly not have enough time to finish it, and then I wouldn't be done with it before the end of the readathon, aka the beginning of the next readathon that I'm in, and I didn't want to have a book carrying over from one readathon into the next, so I just decided to put pause on that book, and I will read it after both of these readathons are over. So I completed 4 of the 7 challenges. I read 3 books. I actually began reading Asymmetry a couple days before this readathon, so I guess technically I was cheating, and you could say I read 2.5 books, but like, whatever, I'm counting it. So I read 3 books. The first book that I read was Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday. So, all right. I gave this book 3 stars. This was a very literary, very, high-minded, cerebral, intellectual book. It's told in 3 sections. The first section, I forget what they're called, but they all have names. And the first section tells the story of a very famous, award-winning author who is having a love affair with a much younger woman, and it's told from her perspective. And she's an editor, I believe, at a book publisher, and he is just well-known and a luminary, and like she's in awe of him. And first it's just sort of like a physical affair, they're just having sex, and then they sort of begin to form a really quite quirky but lovely cross-generational relationship. She never feels completely let into his world, but they do fall in love. And she sees him aging, and he wonders whether or not he's enough for her in that department because he's getting older and she's still in the prime of her life, etc., etc. The second section tells the very harrowing story of a man who hails from Iraq, who is trying to travel home to visit his brother and gets detained at Heathrow Airport and asked a whole bunch of questions. And while he's in a holding cell waiting for them to decide whether they're going to allow him to travel or allow him into England, He basically recalls all of the sort of trials and tribulations of his family history, and you learn a lot about a very different perspective on life from a family living in a very war-torn area. His brother is a very, very talented pianist, and he has a lot of interests in music and talks about his relationship to music a lot in the stories that he tells about his family. And then in the third section, it's an interview with the author from the first section named Ezra Blazer, and eventually they sort of connect. They don't directly connect. They're just sort of all presented in this volume as a novel, and it's very non-traditional. It's like a patchwork of, like, you know, humanity kind of thing. And I guess the concept that I got from it was this idea of sort of looking at art and how it impacts people, and then how we all sort of digest art, but then also looking at the difference between the art and the artist, and how someone who's very, very different from you, living in a very different world, can either create art that moves and inspires you, even though you're so different, or how someone who is very, very different can be moved or inspired by your work when you're an artist. And the sort of the context, the difference between the art that someone creates and who they are and where they come from and whether it's important at all, the sort of context or the life or the world of that person's life in which this art sort of found its birth. And there's also this idea that I see of, like, you know, how some people interact with art in terms of creating it or consuming it, or just learning to play piano, for instance. They interact with art and music as a form of escape from a very dangerous or dissatisfying life, whereas other people are free to explore their relationship with art in a very in-depth and intense, ambitious way. They're hoping to leave their mark on the world. They're seeking a form of self-expression, and they want to change the world with their art. And just all the different ways that we interact with art, whether it be literature, music, what have you. And there's a point in the first section where the author, Ezra, is talking to his girlfriend who's much younger than him. He's talking about how when he was first writing short stories, he would like to create characters that were very, very different from one another and had very different viewpoints on things, and put them in a coffee shop or a restaurant or somewhere and have them end up talking and arguing their viewpoints to one another. And how he eventually learned that they don't need to be that on the nose about it. Like, you can create two characters and put them in a story together, side by side, and not have them actually discuss their religious differences or their political differences or how they grew up or whatever, but still have, just by the fact that they're placed next to each other in that piece, have that be enough to sort of create a message on its own in a more subtle way. And I feel like that was kind of Lisa Halliday's way of saying, these stories are relevant on a theme. This is not necessarily, you know, Train Spotting or the movie Crash, where, like, this character here is going to suddenly show up in this story over here, and maybe they do, maybe they don't, but that's actually not the point. So I appreciated that. I will say that all of these ideas were very, very cerebral and kind of floating up in the air, and intellectual and interesting in that way, but I did not feel emotionally invested or connected to this novel. I thought it was interesting, again, just on a very sort of heady, cerebral, intellectual way, and it didn't thrill me. And I also will say that this book requires a lot of patience, because you do suddenly switch gears and you start wondering, when are these going to connect? And then eventually you realize maybe they're not gonna, and then you're like, oh, okay, I see. But, like, it's in a very subtle way. So it's not for everybody. I didn't love it. I certainly did not hate it. I didn't even dislike it, but I wasn't thrilled by it, and I suppose I need to probably read it again to get more from it. I don't know if I necessarily feel like reading it again. It was beautiful writing. I liked the prose in many cases, and it was funny. But yeah, it was just very cerebral and kind of floaty and out there in the world of ideas, and not visceral enough for me, because I'm a very emotional reader. So I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I gave it 3 stars. Okay, so then the next book that I read was the short story collection by Jeffrey Eugenides entitled Fresh Complaint. This collection is spanned just the gamut from 1-star stories to 5-star stories. I had 2 favorites in this that were rated 5 stars. I had 1 1-star, 2 2-stars, 3 3-star stories, 2 4-star stories, and then the 2 5-star stories. The best stories in this collection were stories that had a unique setting and or plot combined with Eugenides' beautiful writing. And the worst stories in this were the ones that just came in, there were my main complaint with this, my main complaint for Fresh Complaint is that this collection is just myopically focused on the ennui of heterosexual white middle-aged men who in most cases have created a mess for themselves and are feeling the pain. They have marital distress going on. They're going to lose their family. They got themselves into a bad situation, or they have career things going on. One guy tries to defraud his boss for a whole bunch of money. And it's just like a lot of stories on the same theme that made me sort of feel like, okay, there's too much of a focus on this one sort of character. I got really tired of reading about it. And then there were, there was, the final story was called Fresh Complaint, and this is a story that was actually horrible. It was 1 star. Of course, it was well written on the sentence level, but it's the one story that prominently features a person of color as a character. This young woman who is being forced into an arranged marriage. She's from India, and her mother is insistent on this tradition. And in order to get out of it, she decides if she's not a virgin, then she won't be acceptable to this boy's family, and then she won't have to marry this guy. So instead of just insisting that she's not going to do it, what she decides to do is to make herself not a virgin anymore. And she basically cajoles and manipulates. Really, this is what the story is telling us. This heterosexual, white, middle-aged, married man into sleeping with her in this hotel room, who's old enough to be her father, much, much older. Tells him that she's 19. Turns out she's actually 16 at the time. And then she charges him with rape. But it's all trumped up, and they never actually complete the act. But the point of the story is about this woman who, in order to escape the harmful traditions from her native culture in India, decides to basically trump up a rape charge against this poor middle-aged white man who just wants to cheat on his wife. It just so tone deaf on so many levels. Just really serves as an apology and or excuse for statutory rape. Do these things happen? Sure, they probably do happen now and then. But the fact that Eugenides chose to write an entire short story about that and to focus it on this woman who is lying is victim blaming, and it's harmful because it amplifies this message that a lot of times rape isn't rape. That's not a story that needs to be told. Does it happen? I suppose. But you don't need to focus your literary genius on writing a story about it, because that's not the headline. The headline in this story about rape in the world today is that women are afraid to come forward when it happens to them. Hated that story. I gave it 1 star because not only did I think it was a bad plot, I thought it made the world a worse place, which is kind of my rubric for 1-star things. So I think it was just very unfortunate and really, really ugly, and I hated that story. So it left a very sour taste in my mouth, especially since it was the last story in the collection, and that's the worst story. There was another story that I really didn't like that I also thought demonstrated something that is pervasive throughout this collection, which is just a focus on just people's biology and sex and lust and desires as really defining them as people. And throughout this collection comes this really clear theme of paranoia about what women are intending, poor men not knowing what to do or what's expected of them, and being wronged and having to face, the dissolution of a marriage or financial ruin or something, really because of stupid things that they have done. And I just didn't really side with very many of the narrators. I didn't like most of them. The 2 stories that I really loved, one called Airmail, about a young man who goes on a journey around the world trying to find himself and kind of loses his mind a little bit. I loved that story, gave it 5 stars, and a story called The Oracular Vulva, which apparently was an excised section of Middlesex about a sexologist taking all these stories together. I just literally didn't know what to say because some of them enraged me and were terrible, and some of them were and then some of them were fantastic, and so I just honestly averaged the numbers together and I got 3.1. So I gave this book 3 stars. And the last book that I read, I just finished a little while ago, and that is Up from the Blue by Susan Henderson. This was her first novel. So the first novel by Susan Henderson that I read last year, back in April, I think, was The Flicker of Old Dreams, and I didn't know that that was actually her second novel. And after I read it, I loved it so much, it became my favorite book of 2018, and so I decided that I would immediately went back and bought Up From the Blue. The framing device for this story, if you will, is this young woman who is pregnant, and her husband is away on business. But she goes into labor early, and she's going to have her baby prematurely, and she has no one to take her to the hospital, so she has to call her father, from whom she's quite estranged. And so then you learn her history, and the story becomes really her memories from being a little girl interacting with her mother. So basically it's the story of her mother, who's clearly very unwell and very depressed and mentally ill, possibly with bipolar disorder. Maybe she had postpartum depression that wasn't treated. You don't ever really find out, and that's not exactly the point. The point is the story of her growing up with this unwell mother and a very cold, regimental military father who just expects her mother to get better and to just be stronger. And how that does not work. It's heartbreaking, and it made me so angry. It made me cry. It was sweet. It was beautifully written. Susan Henderson started out her writing life as a poet, and it comes through in both of the novels by her that I have read. Her prose is just lyrical and whimsical, and she can make everyday impressions come across in a really just sort of like profound and graceful lyrical way. I love reading both of the books that she's written. I loved reading this. I read it in about a day and a half. I read 30% in my first reading. I read 30% in my second reading, and then I finished it tonight. I absolutely adored it. It deals with themes of mental illness and, parental discord and family trauma and depression. There's a little bit of dealing with race. She has one of her only friends in school, this little girl, is a black girl named Cheryl. And so she interacts with her family a little bit, and you get a kind of a sideways glance at the issue of race through the eyes of an innocent young child that I thought was really well done without being unnecessarily traumatic or exploitative in any way. It's just a darn good book. Really fantastic. One of my favorite books, certainly, of 2019. I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend The Flicker of Old Dreams, and anything else that Susan Henderson writes, I'm going to be pre-ordering without question. So I gave 5 stars to Up From the Blue, which was wonderful because it had big shoes to fill, and it did not disappoint. So those were the 3 books that I read for this readathon. I was going to then read an Orchestra of Minorities, and I've decided not to do that because I just want to finish this readathon cleanly, having no books currently open, so that in about half an hour I can start reading one of my thriller books for Thriller-a-thon. So those are my sort of mini reviews for the books that I read for Contemporary-A-Thon Round 4. I had a wonderful time in this readathon this year. Last time I did Contemporary-A-Thon, it did not go well because I started reading a book that I just didn't like much, and I didn't put it down because I was too stubborn to put it down. So I just forced myself to get through it, and it took me the entire week. So this was much, much better. I had a great time. I laughed, I cried. I had a really fun time vlogging. I hope you all enjoyed my vlogs if you saw them. I did a lot of cooking this week because I'm starting to cook now, which is like personal growth. Yay. I'm kind of sad that this readathon is over, but I'm going right into another one. So I guess there's, no time for tears. And I will certainly be taking part in more readathons this year after Thriller-a-thon. I don't know which ones yet, but I will. And I will certainly be vlogging off and on throughout the year because it's something that I really enjoy to do, even if it does kind of take up a lot of time. So that is my wrap-up. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, please hit the like button. If you loved this video and you would like to see more content like this in the future, you can hit the subscribe button. And then if you hit the little bell icon next to the little gear thing there, I think, it'll notify you every time I post something new, and you won't miss out on anything. I usually post on Mondays and Fridays, or at least I'm trying to. During readathons like this, it's like anybody's guess. I'm kind of posting whenever and a lot more often than twice a week. So thank you so much for being here for this little bookish conversation. I appreciate your time, and until next time, I will be here in the dark reading. Bye, guys.